a second here. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're really excited for this event, this forum, and we're here tonight to talk about water, Pico Rivera Water Agency, also PFOS and PFOA, better known by its nickname Forever Chemicals. And tonight we have a very special guest. Andrew, Lara, and I look to host this community forum as a way to continue updating the community, educating the community on important issues going on in our city. And we posted this, and we were able to get a hold of our assembly member, Christina Garcia, who is joining us. And so she's going to join us for just a bit to give some opening remarks, because it was actually her landmark legislation that she drafted and authored and advocated for that allowed for the state of California to better regulate these forever chemicals. So I am going to hand it over to our Assemblywoman that represents our area, Assemblywoman Christina Garcia.
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate it. And before I get started, I want to thank yourself and Andrew for putting this together and helping to expand information and education in the community, which is so important on so many issues, but particularly with PFOS, which we call an emerging chemical. It's been around. We've been using it for over 30 years, but really only recently have started to understand its dangers out there. And so I want to thank you guys for putting this together so that the public is better informed and better able to make decisions that work for themselves and their families out there. I also want to thank all the panelists who are taking time today to join the community to help do that. And so environmental justice is something that I deeply care about. It's something I've been working on for the 8 years that I've been in the legislature. I think a lot of us call ourselves environmentalists, but when I think about it, I think about it when I was growing up here and where I live now in Bell Gardens, where there's days where I think about, should I go for a run on the riverbed that's next to the freeway? And is that really healthy given all the pollution in the air? And so that's how I approach environmental justice. It was personal, but along the way, it moved beyond that. It moved into how the railways are affecting our quality of life here, how things like the lead from Exide are making our lives shorter and making our kids sicker. And so along the way, I do homework, I read, and I was reading about lead contamination in different parts of the world. I was reading about Flint and lead in the water there. And I stumbled upon an environmental working group report about PFOS. And I was like, oh, what is PFOS? And they had a map. And in that map, they showed some of the initial testing that the US government had done. And in LA County, when I zoned in on the spots that were, of alert, they were only in my district. And so I was like, oh, what is this? And why is it only in my district? I want to say that in part it was shocking, but in part it wasn't, because my community has been used and treated like we're disposable or a wasteland, all of my life and longer. And so I started to read about PFOS and PFOA. I started to read about how it never broke down, which is why it's called a forever chemical, how it's in our water, how it's in our food sometimes, and how it stays in our bodies. And a little bit might not seem like that bad of a deal, but it accumulates and never leaves. As part of why it's a forever chemical. And it can be carcinogen. It has a number of other problems out there. It's found in things like Teflon. It's found in things like our clothes, because it's a great chemical. It turns out that it makes things waterproof. And so we thought this was an amazing chemical. We didn't realize that it was also something that was really problematic for our environment, but most importantly, for our health. And so there's a lot that we don't know. And I think that while there's alarm, I would say that the alarm has to be mostly, I would say, recommended if you're pregnant, if you have a young child, if you're nursing, then maybe if there is PFOS in your water, you should maybe not drink the water. But the reality is that we still don't know all the side effects. We still don't know all the recommendations, and that's part of what we're trying to figure out at the moment. And so I introduced AB 756 in 2019, because while I'm telling you if it's in your water, you shouldn't drink it if you're pregnant or nursing, the reality is that there was no way for you to know that it was in your water. And so now starting this last year, if it's detected in your water, it has to be in the notices that we send out at the end of the year. If the levels are high enough, you'll get an individual notice about this and some information about it, so you can start to figure out, what are the next steps. And I know PFOS has been a discussion, in Pico Rivera. I know that the water, our water board there has been trying to figure out solutions. I want to say that for the last 18 months, they have very collaborative, been talking with the city, been talking with the legislature about how we protect our constituencies, how we're going to pay for something that they didn't cause. Let me be clear. Neither the city nor the water district caused this problem, but the reality is that now they're faced with the responsibility of keeping all their constituents safe and making sure we still have water running out there. And so we're discussing how to move forward and how do we pay for this? How do we pay for this in a way that doesn't affect our consumers too much, because you didn't cause this problem, and so why should we be stuck with paying for it? And we haven't found the ideal choices. This was a topic of conversation when the legislative year started. COVID has really shrunken our year and our ability to do something, and we're struggling financially out there. But I'm committed to figuring out solutions that are fair and equitable for the community, and I'm excited to continue to work with leaders like Brent and Andrew to make sure that Pico Rivera gets safe water. And I think we all have that goal in common. And the first step is having information to the public. And so I appreciate this forum. And then lastly, I want to talk about the water replenishment district that is also partnering to try to figure out ways to create low interest programs, loans for cities and water districts to be able to mitigate and clean up the PFOS. While we go after the bad actors and the people that contaminated our water, we know that process will take decades, but we have needs now to take action. And so the WRD is out there working with our partners and our leaders like Brent and Andrew to figure out how we fund these projects for this cleanup and how we ensure you have clean water out there. And so just, want to thank you all. I know there's a lot of questions. I'm excited to hear the presentation from everybody out there. I know at the state level, the State Water Board is continuously tracking this. They're being aggressive. They continue to lower thresholds for disclosures out there. And we're starting to engage in discussions of how we're going to make sure we clean up this water and that we are all safe out there. And then more importantly, how do we make sure as we have new chemicals that we're using, we're smarter about it in the future. And so thank you, Andrew and Brent, for your leadership. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And to the community, thank you for joining us in this discussion and helping to share the information with your family and friends.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Assemblymember, for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Can I ask a clarifying question? Are you staying with us for much longer, or are you going to attend other forums and meetings that you have planned? Hold on, I think our moderator is unmuting you.
I'm going to be here for a little bit, but I do have a few other items on the docket today. I know that this is being recorded, and I have staff on here also, so we'll be tracking. And you can always contact our office for follow-up information, but I do have staff that will stay here the whole time.
Perfect. Thank you. We really appreciate that, and we appreciate you making the time to be here yourself, even if it's just for a little bit. But we appreciate you talking a little bit about the work that you did. I know here in the city, we are tackling this problem, and Andrew Lara, who's also here and co-hosting with me, he's on the Pico Water Board, and they are tackling the issue. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about that from him. We have an agenda for the evening to go through, the various stages of tonight's presentation. We're first going to hear a little bit from both Andrew and I, and then we're going to hear a little bit from an expert who knows a lot about PFOS and PFOA. That's actually what they do. They're going to educate us a little bit. And then we're going to hear from a special guest, and I actually would like to hand it over to Andrew Lara to tell us a little bit more about our special guest and a little bit more about the work that the Pico Water Agency has done to combat these forever chemicals. And then after he's done, we'll go ahead, I'll take it back just for a little bit, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Brent. Thank you everyone for attending. Brent and I, we started talking about various subjects and how to educate the community topics that are of great importance. I think this one came to a head a year ago when it was announced that Pico Rivera had high levels of PFOS and PFOA. And thank you very much to Assemblywoman Garcia, because it was really her bill that put this at the forefront for the state of California. And then as I started to educate myself more, I saw a Netflix documentary called The Devil That We Know. And that really put everything in perspective in regards to how dangerous these chemicals can be, how they don't break down. I met Cathy Swanson at a conference in Palm Springs, and I was just amazed with her ability to explain PFOS and PFOA in very simple terms. So I think you're going to be very impressed with her presentation. I've also connected with another gentleman. His name is Trevor Schaefer, and he's created Trevor's Law. And what that is, it's a law that was passed through Congress at the federal level, and it creates a national database for cancer. Because as we know, if you've ever heard of Erin Brockovich and seen her movie, and with the city of Hinckley in California, it really started with neighbors talking to neighbors and discovering that this person had cancer over here 2 blocks away, 3 blocks away. And then they started to put things together, and then they said, hey, our water tastes funny. So what Trevor's doing is he advocated for a national database so we can look at cancer clusters, and we can start making some connections to potential environmental issues. I sit on the Pico Water Board. I've been on the Pico Water Board since about 2013. We've improved our infrastructure. We've drilled a new well. We've changed out over thousands of linear feet of old pipeline. But then when this issue came aboard, we really had to hit the books, and we had to rely on experts on how to deal with this. I can tell you at the Pico Water real briefly, we've put together a consultant, we put together an engineer, we've started to spec out our system, and we've started to look at the cost. And as Assemblywoman Garcia brought out, we've started to knock on WRD's door, because they have a clean drinking water fund. Because one thing I don't want is I don't want our constituents to have to pay for this cleanup, because it will be costly. And no one in Pico Rivera was responsible for putting those chemicals there. So we don't want our constituents and our ratepayers to have to pay for that. So I thank you for joining. Brent, I'm going to hand this over, and then we're going to start with Cathy.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm really appreciative of Andrew's leadership. When this first became an issue, I think it might have been when we first heard about it in the Whittier Daily News. But we as a city were being proactive in our notification efforts. So there was laws being passed that required and mandated reporting of these chemicals. But they mandated reporting by a certain date, and we actually reported before the date that it went into effect. We were being proactive in our reporting. And so when that happened, Andrew was the first call I received regarding the issue. And that day he put together a small group, a small panel of people, all community leaders, to talk about what it is that we need to do about these forever chemicals, this PFOS and PFOA in our water. And it was a tremendous feat of leadership, and that is one of the reasons why I love partnering with Andrew on issues like this. In terms of the work that we're doing on council for Pico Rivera, in terms of the PFOS and PFOA, we are looking at ways to fund filtration systems. There are a few different ways that you can filter out these particles, and what we're looking to do is create 2 different tiers of filtration that not only get rid of PFOS and PFOA, but other similar molecules, forever chemicals, that are somewhat different in nature that don't get captured by the primary system. So we're looking to have a 2-tiered filtration system to make sure that there is zero trace or very close to zero trace of these chemicals when they actually arrive at your tap. Obviously, this is a very important issue. This is an issue that concerns all of us as residents. I drink my water out of the tap through a Brita filter, just like anyone else. But that's not enough, and we need to do more as a city and as a region, quite frankly. And we need to look for funding opportunities and grants, and whether it's loans, but we need to be proactive in solving this issue. So with that, tonight we have a great presentation from a couple of different individuals like Andrew just mentioned. We're going to start off with Cathy, who's going to tell us a little bit and educate us on PFOS and PFOA. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Cathy Swanson, who's going to educate us. So Cathy, go ahead.
I want to first thank you guys so much for allowing me to be here. Andrew, it was wonderful meeting you a year or so ago, whenever it was, pre-COVID, when we had trade shows. And I really applaud the efforts that, both the city and the water district have taken. You guys have been on the cutting edge at looking at how to help your constituents. And I love being a part of that here tonight. I am also just in awe to be on the same panel as Assemblywoman Garcia. I really respect everything you've done, and thank you for the service that you've done. So tonight, the goal is, education. I do work for an ion exchange company, so full disclosure. But I'll tell you a little bit about myself if you want to go to the next slide. I've been doing groundwater remediation for probably 12, 13 years, somewhere in there. With that, it's been mostly ion exchange. I have sold other technologies, and I really believe that with this PFAS, that ion exchange is the way to go. And we'll get into why that is. I live here in Southern California. I live in Fullerton. Yes, my wells have PFAS in them too, so this is something very near and dear to my heart as well. So what we're going to talk about tonight, we're going to talk about what is PFAS, where did it come from, what are the health effects, how do we treat PFAS, and talk a little bit about the ion exchange, the product that'll take the components out of the water. And then we'll talk about what the impact on Pico water will be with some of these treatment systems. There we go. So as we've already heard tonight, they're called the forever chemicals. It's because they're environmentally persistent, they're bioaccumulative. What does that all mean? It means it doesn't break down naturally. These are man-made chemicals that were made for different purposes, but we have a lot of trouble destroying them. So it's the good qualities about them that made us like them in the first place. So they were first discovered in the late 30s, 1940s timeframe. And they found that this stuff was waterproof, it was heat resistant, it was really slick, it's grease resistant. One of the main things that it's used for is putting out fires from airplanes. If you've heard of AFFF, or aqueous film forming foam. And the reason it's so great is it can smother that fire and really quench it. So it's done a lot of good things for humanity. But the problem is, because the bond inside, the carbon fluorine bond, is so strong, it's really hard to destroy. So a couple things we want to do when we talk about treatment. The first thing is we want to capture it. The second thing is we do want to destroy it. Right now, most of the destruction is through incineration, and not just lighting a fire and over charcoal, but it has to be at temperatures over 1100 degrees C and at certain pressures within the kiln. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but go ahead to the next slide. So I think Brent talked a little bit about how there was, a lot of different PFAS. So when we say PFAS with an A, that refers to over 5,000 different chemicals, which it's short for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And under that, there's all kinds of different classifications. My point in this slide is not really to give you a chemistry lesson, I'll put myself to sleep, but to point out that so far, we've only really been focused on PFOA and PFOS. There are other chemicals that we need to look at in order to get them all out of the water, and our government is looking at that as well. So let's go to the next slide. Oops, I think it skipped, there we go, okay. So first of all, how do we test our drinking water? Right now, there's a method called EPA Method 537.1, and it looks at 18 of the most common PFAS in the water. Like I said, PFOS and PFOA, those are the two that have gotten the most attention. Those are 8-chain polymers. Sometimes you hear the word C8, and it's because there's 8 carbons on it and they're surrounded by that force field of fluorine. Those are known as long chain PFAS, just so you know. Like I said, there are other short chain ones, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. But as we look at the California Water Resource Control Board and their division of drinking water, they're going to be adding more of these shorter chain chemicals to the list of chemicals that need to have notification levels. Right now, PFOA and PFOS are the only 2, but I believe there's going to be another 7 more, and I believe it's the 7 directly above the 2 that are in the square. So more to come on that. We'll go to the next slide. So we kind of touched on this a little bit too. Where does it come from? Because quite honestly, it's ubiquitous in the environment. One of the main culprits has been the AFFF foam, aqueous film forming foam. And if you see the picture of them putting out that fire, it's not that we've had that many airplane fires around here because it puts out jet fuel. It's because they've practiced so often. And when they practice, they cover it, and then they would just, they'd cover the fire, and then they would wash away all the residue. And so all of that just went right into the ground and right into our water table. You can also find it as coatings for stain water and fire resistance. So you see, like, a Gore-Tex jacket used a lot of PFAS. And it was great if you're out jogging in the rain, but not so great from the chemicals that they use. It's been used in adhesives, cosmetics, cleaning products, food packaging. This little WebMD thing from February 2016 is interesting. Basically, every pizza box used to have PFAS in it to keep the pizza from sticking. Every microwave popcorn bag had PFAS to keep the popcorn from sticking. A lot of the wrappers that we would put our burgers and sandwiches in, they all had PFAS because of that great release. Some of the baking papers, parchment papers that you use have been found to have PFAS in them. So, there's more sources than just the water. Chrome plating was another big area where they've used it. So the picture down in the right corner is a bath where they would dip something in for chrome plating. And what they would do, they would put this perfluorinated compound on top because it would keep the mist down. And it actually helped with the safety of the workers. I think we mentioned Teflon pans, and that's why that's in there. But Teflon is made basically from some of the PFOA, PFOS type compounds. And that's why it's there now. Of course, today, drinking water is a source because of all that's gotten there. And another source is from wastewater systems. So as they concentrate all of the waste from these things, they concentrate up the PFAS in the waste. There's actually places that have high concentrations of PFAS in their drinking water because of the fertilizer that was spread there over many, many years. So let's go to the next slide. So we talked about, or it was mentioned, the Environmental Working Group. That's a wonderful site if you're looking for information. And they have, they keep a map pretty much up to date. This particular, I have military sites, drinking water sites, and other known sites that are highlighted. One thing that I think is interesting, if you look at Michigan, New Hampshire, some of these states, they've taken a lot more proactive stance on testing. And so I don't know that Michigan necessarily has more PFAS, it's just that they've tested more. California, luckily, is also a state where we've done a lot of testing. And if you want to go to the next slide, the California State Water Resource Control Board. That's a mouthful. Anyway, you can see on the left there, all the places that they've found the different chemicals in California. And if you zoom in on Pico Rivera, you can see the little triangle between all the freeways there. There's a lot of PFAS in that water. If you were to zoom out, you would see that all around LA, all around Orange County, it's pretty ubiquitous. So we'll go on. So what have our regulators done about it? So in 2009, the EPA had what we call notification levels of 400 for PFOA and 200, and I'm talking parts per trillion, so 400 part per trillion and 200 part per trillion of PFOS for drinking water. And not very many places hit that level. They had what they called the UCMR 3, and that's basically where they required water districts all across the country to test their water. The results of that test came out in 2016, and almost simultaneously when the results came out, the EPA lowered the notification threshold. I actually know a guy from a water agency who found that he was out of compliance when a reporter from the New York Times called him and asked him how he could serve out of compliance water to his constituents, and he was flabbergasted. A lot of places had to scramble because they did have PFAS, a combined PFOA and PFOS at greater than 70 parts per trillion. And so what's happened over the years is states have had to kind of step up and lower the bar. So what you find is some states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, they have a combined notification level. And that looks at PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, PFHXS, PFHPA. And so the trend is really to reduce. And you can see California now has a notification level of 5.1 for PFOA and 6.5 for PFOS, some of the lowest in the country. We have a response level that's a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, what the Division of Drinking Water is asking cities to do is really to provide water at non-detect for the constituents. And I'll show you how we do that in just a sec. Let's go to the next slide. So trying to wrap your head about what is 1 part per trillion, it's such a small amount. It's a drop in an Olympic-sized pool. It's a penny in $100 billion. It's 1 drop of impurity in 500,000 barrels of water. It's 6 inches as we move closer to the sun. I mean, it's a minuscule amount. If you go to the next slide, so if it's such a small amount, why are we worried about it? How can this hurt us? It's all about bioaccumulation. Part per trillion in the water equals part per billion in the blood. And I found this picture really moving. These children are from New York, and they found that they had a hot spot in the area, and they were testing people. So like the little boy's sign, his PFOA blood level is 142 part per billion. Now remember, in the water, there's only part per trillion levels, and that was, granted, that was a little bit of a higher area than it is here, but it accumulates. And he's got like 1,000 times higher than the level that's in the water. So that's why we care. There is a heartbreaking exercise that you can go through. The California EPA, which is called OEHA, O-E-H-H-A, they've done studies on people in the Los Angeles area. Basically, everybody on this call has some level of PFAS in their blood. It just is and is. So they estimate that 95% of the human population has it. They've found PFAS in the blood of polar bears and the livers of whales. So when I say it's ubiquitous, that's what I mean. It's everywhere. We've all got it. So we'll go to the next slide. So now we get into what are the health effects. I think it's really interesting. The health effects that are listed here are some of the ones that came out of the largest epidemiological study ever done in the United States. And I'll show you where that came from in a minute. But there was something like 70,000 people participated in this study, and these are the health effects that came out from it. Now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a toxicologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm an engineer by training, but these are the things that came out of the study. Reproductive and development issues, high cholesterol, liver and kidney function issues, low infant birth rates, suppressed immune systems, thyroid issues, cancers of the bladder, prostate, liver, and thyroid. So those are also pretty common in the United States here. We'll go to the next one. If you want a little bit more backstory on it, I really recommend the movie Dark Waters. The other one, The Devil We Know, is also, that's a documentary, kind of on the same thing. You need a jaw strap, though, to take your jaw off the floor by the time you're done with that one. There's also the book called Exposure. It's been written by Rob Bilott. Rob is a personal hero of mine. He was the lawyer that is depicted by Mark Ruffalo in the movie Dark Waters. And he basically spent 20 years going after DuPont and finally, broke them and got them to, stop making some of the PFAS and actually get the EPA to regulate it down to lower levels. So how do we get it out of the water? Oops. So if we could go back a little bit. Okay. Treatment options. Okay. So if you have really high levels, like if you're at a site where they use AFFF foam all the time, things like foam fractionation and regenerable resin may make sense. These aren't necessarily the right applications for drinking water. A lot of people talk about RO. Oh, RO is the gold standard. There's a few things about RO. First, it only gets 98% of what's in the water out. Second, it's very expensive. Third, there's no belt and suspenders. And if it takes you several weeks to get your results back, you don't know if you have a problem with the membrane. But the biggest issue is that the way that a membrane works is you have a reject stream, and you basically throw away 25% of whatever comes in. So we live in a state where we don't have a lot of water. We can't just throw away 25% of our water. The other thing about that water is now we've concentrated the PFAS in it, but we haven't destroyed it. If we now discharge that PFAS-laden water to the ocean, all we're gonna do is poison our fish, the food supply, and polar bears will get worse. So that's not really an option. The two options that most people look at are carbon absorption, otherwise known as GAC, or single-use resin. So let's go to the next slide. So like I said, I work for an ion exchange manufacturer. Here's what I like about the single-use resin. Number one, it's going to get rid of more of the PFAS in the water. So it's excellent at getting out PFOA and PFOS, but it also gets out those shorter chains like the PFBS, which is the shortest of the sulfonics. So it's, if you're going to put something in, get something that's going to take all of it out. It also has a much smaller footprint. It works really fast because it's really selective for PFAS. Because of that, you can put more water through a smaller footprint. At the end of the day, though, I think what really speaks to everybody is what is it going to cost? And every water quality is different, you really do need to evaluate what it looks like. Generally speaking, the PFAS selective ion exchange resin is going to be the least expensive way to go. And I've done some of the work for Pico Water and for the city of Pico Rivera, and I'll show you some of that in a little bit. So we'll move on. Resin's been accepted. I'm going to go really quick through the next couple slides here. It's been used a lot of places. It's accepted by the EPA, the Air Force, the Army Corps of Engineers, and we'll move on. Right now, there's 26 states that are using ion exchange resin. There's one system in California right now, soon to be 3, I'm very excited to say, where we're using resin for for PFAS removal. And there's over 500 point of entry systems. So that's if you had a system coming into your house, almost like a softener. So go ahead. This just shows how selective the resin is. It's extremely selective, even over some of the other things in the water, like your typical nitrate, sulfate, chloride. And we'll move on this one. And this just shows how selective the resin is for PFAS. Most of the thing is taken up by the other anions in the water that are perfectly normal. And there's a tremendous capacity for the PFAS on a resin bead. So what does this really mean to Pico? Let's move on. Oh, here's what it looks like. This is just a fun slide. So if you compare a pin to what a resin bead looks like, that's kind of what it looks like. And go ahead and skip this one and we'll go, there we go. Okay. So just to take Pico water, for example. So there's 3 different systems there. They range between 1,200 and 1,600 gallons per minute. Basically, with one set of vessels, we can deliver water that is basically at non-detect. So, you know, the capital cost for only the treatment is somewhere between, you know, $550,000 and $600,000. And you're looking at 12 cents per 1,000 gallons in order to take this out. So your lead vessel in this thing will run 14 to 18 months. If you flow faster, it runs faster. And essentially the way that it works is it goes in the front vessel and the lag vessel is there just as a polish to make sure that you're always at non-detect. Go to the next slide. And that's my presentation. Again, I thank you all very much.
Cathy, thank you so much. Everyone's muted, but if everyone can give her a round of applause. You know, this was exceptionally educational, tons of information in here in a very short amount of slides. And I've seen, you know, a similar presentation, if not the same presentation, but I learned more new stuff hearing this again. And so we have another speaker, Trevor, who's going to talk with us. But Trevor, if we took a few minutes to take some questions from the audience directly for Cathy, would that be a huge burden on you, Trevor? Or you know, should we get through your presentation and then ask questions after?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, absolutely. No problem.
Okay, perfect. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take questions from the audience. We'll see if we can get through 3 to 5 questions right now. Then we're going to go to Trevor, who's going to give us a presentation about the federal legislation that Andrew mentioned that is looking to document cancer clusters so that we can better identify where these cancer clusters are and identify sources and remediate them and get rid of them. But we're going to go ahead and talk or ask some questions. And here's how we're going to do that. Everyone is muted. You're going to, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. Not physically, although that might work too, but there's a way to raise your hand on Zoom. You should see on the bottom of your screen, participants. If you click on participants, a little window will pop up. And on the bottom right-hand side of that little window, you should see a button that says raise hand. And you'll be able to raise your hand. And our moderator will actually be able to see if you've raised your hand and can unmute you to ask your question. If you have a question, because of time and because we have guests with us, we're going to limit the speakers who have questions to about 60 seconds to ask your question. And then we're going to hand it over to Cathy to talk a little bit to answer that question. So if you have a question, once again, you click on participants on the bottom of your screen. You should see participants. It's got two little people and it has a number next to it. Click on that. A little pop-up will pop up. And then raise hand on the bottom right-hand corner of that pop-up is what you press to notify us that you have a question.
As of now, no one has questions.
Cathy, thank you for your presentation. I have a question for you. You know, this came pretty much as a surprise to us last year dealing with Pico Water. We had been monitoring the legislation that was working its way through the Assembly and then the Senate in the state of California. And then when it was enacted, and then we were waiting for the California State Drinking Water Board. I know I said that wrong. You had a hard time saying that. We were waiting to see what the notification, what the response level, what they were going to fall at. Because the EPA has about 70 for PFOS. And we knew that it was going to be really, it was going to be much lower than that. So we waited because we didn't know where we were going to fall as for Pico Water. So my question for you is, when you take a look, you mentioned that it costs about about $500,000 to install the filter for one well site. And at Pico Water, we're calculating having to install filters for 3 well sites. So that takes us to 1.5 million. And I know this question is tied to how many minerals are in our water, so on and so forth, but for a water district like Pico Water, which covers half the service area of Pico Rivera, they have about 5,400 connections. How much is the yearly upkeep of the resin that you estimated?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what I looked at is you would need to change out one of those vessels anywhere, I think I said 14 to 18 months. So, you know, say it lasts a year and a half because you may not run all the time. So about a year and a half, you would change out the lead vessel. That would be somewhere, I don't know, $120,000 to change out that lead, depending on how much is in the vessel and where it gets disposed of, things like that. Your lag bed becomes the lead, and your new bed with the clean resin becomes your polish.
Got it. So $100,000 per vessel, and we're looking at 3 vessels if we treat 3 wells. So that takes us to roughly about $300,000 a year to change out the resin, and that's every year pretty much till infinity, to ascend.
Till it's cleaned up.
Yeah, till it's cleaned up. I think that. So when we realized that, we said, hey, $300,000 to our budget, that translates to about a $4 or $5 rate increase every month for our ratepayers. And that's why at Pico Water, and I know the city feels the same way, we said, wait a minute here. These citizens had nothing to do with putting PFOS, PFOA. We don't want them to pay for this. So that's why we're actively looking through avenues such as WRD and whatnot to try to offset the cost. I know Christina Garcia briefly touched on it. She was trying to put together legislation that would help communities like ours find grants or monies to offset that cost. But I think that's important. Brent, I don't really see any other questions. Do you want to go ahead and move forward?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to move forward. Cathy, are you going to be staying with us till the end of the time at 8,
Yeah.
or do you?
No,
Okay,
I'll hang
perfect.
around.
So, perfect. We're going to have another Q&A portion after Trevor's presentation. And so if anyone has questions, we can take the questions at that time. So I'm going to go ahead. Oh, Andrew, did you have something?
Yeah, let me just briefly introduce Trevor. I just met him a few days ago. I was reading this book by Erin Brockovich, and it's called Superman's Not Coming. And Erin Brockovich is pretty famous for her advocacy with water. And while I was reading a few chapters in, she talks about Trevor Schaefer. She talks about Trevor's Law. She talks about cancer and how there's carcinogens in our water that are creating people to develop cancer. And she talked about Trevor's work. Trevor is a childhood survivor of cancer. And the month of September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. So Trevor, without further ado, we welcome you to our program. We thank you for taking the time. We will switch over to your slides right now. And you have the floor. Thank you very much.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this tonight, and for everyone for being involved. It's very important work, and really appreciate it. And, you know, as we talked about a little bit earlier on, that it's, you know, it's going to start at the grassroots level, and we're going to make more change by collaborating and working together, and then working up from there. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm a brain cancer survivor, and co-founder and executive director of Trevor's Track Foundation. Go to the next slide. I was a little bit of background on me. I was raised in a small town on a glacial lake about 100 miles north of Boise, Idaho. I was diagnosed in November of 2002 at the age of 13 with medulloblastoma brain cancer. I had an 8-hour brain surgery followed by 14 months of radiation and chemotherapy treatment. You can go to the next slide. And during my hospitalizations, post-surgery, and during my treatments, my mother spent a lot of time with me in the hospitals. And with that, she became aware of the prevalence of childhood cancer. And she wanted answers, and she wanted to know why. And so she started to do some research and investigations in our hometown where I was diagnosed originally. And she found out that the year I was diagnosed, there were a total of 5 brain cancers, and the population was 1,700 people. So that was really high for that population. And when she took these statistics and information she had gathered to state and local health departments, she was turned away, either them telling her that there wasn't a problem or that our town was too small to warrant a cancer cluster study. And so in 2009, we founded Trevor's Track Foundation, an organization originally dedicated to raising childhood cancer awareness. You can go to the next slide. A couple things that we did with the foundation is we built a children's cancer pavilion to raise more awareness here in the local park, Julie Davis Park in Boise, Idaho. And then we introduced and promoted Trevor's Law. You can go to the next slide. So also in 2009, we began work to introduce legislation that would address cancer clusters throughout the United States. And this started because in my hometown, and the negative experience my mother had, and issues with trying to get help into the area, she thought that, well, we have Megan's Law to address and pinpoint sexual predators in neighborhoods. So can't we do something similar to develop a law to pinpoint toxic predators? And also, one of the many culprits that we suspect that was contributing to the cancer and other illnesses in my town was in 1994, we had a very large forest fire. So a lot of fire retardant was dumped on that fire and drifted into the lake where everyone, they swam in, they recreated in, and they also get their drinking water from. So that was a big source, and a PFAS source as well. And so the law was introduced originally, and we met with Senator Barbara Boxer, which I'm sure many of you know who that was, from California, former senator. And she introduced the legislation in 2010, and Senator Mike Crapo from here in Idaho co-sponsored it. And Mike Crapo is a Republican, so it was very important to get that bipartisanship to move anything forward in Congress. And just just a little bit more about the law, that it will, there's a big disconnect between state and local agencies and federal agencies when they're collecting data, they're sharing data, and pinpointing cancer clusters or other illnesses. And so the goal of the law is to authorize the federal agencies, mostly the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, to coordinate with state and local governments, institutes of higher education, and the community to investigate and address cancer clusters. On March 29th of 2011, I testified along with Aaron Brockovich at a hearing that was held in the Environment and Public Works Committee on behalf of Trevor's Law. You can go to the next slide. And then a little fast forward a little bit about for the next, it took about 7 years, but from us flying back to DC, lobbying for the bill and trying to get congressional support. And then in 2015, Trevor's Law was attached to the Frank R. Lautenberg toxic chemical for the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, which is also the TSCA reform bill. And Trevor's Law was section 21 of that bill. And then the next year in 2016, President Obama signed TSCA reform bill and Trevor's Law into law. Go to the next slide. And then in 2018, for those 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, nothing was done. There's a lot of frustration. The bill was signed into law, but nothing was done for implementation. We did meet with CDC once, but not a lot was done. But towards the end of the year, there was $1 million that was allocated to Trevor's Law for CDC to restructure their cancer cluster guidelines in accordance with what the language of the law says. You can go to the next slide. And then fast forward to this year, I received an email from the CDC director earlier this summer, giving me an update on where we stand with Trevor's Law. And their plans were to hold focused group discussions with state, territorial, local, and tribal health departments, who those departments will ultimately be tasked with carrying out the new cancer cluster guidelines. And they also had planned to hold focus group discussions with key stakeholders outside of the government, and they wanted to work with us in coordinating these meetings. But unfortunately, due to COVID-19, that has pushed back these focus group discussions to a later date. We're not sure at this point. They're going to keep me posted as to when they can start to schedule these, but my guess it'll probably be sometime next summer. Go to the next slide. And so a shift in focus. I mentioned earlier that we created a foundation, Trevor's Track Foundation for Childhood Cancer Awareness. Due to the ever-changing political climate back in Washington, D.C., and the failure on the government's part to implement Trevor's Law, we've shifted direction slightly with the foundation, and now we're geared more towards working to promote awareness for childhood cancer clusters that exist in our communities, and also support the implementation of Trevor's Law, so we can see the law through to its implementation and make sure that the government doesn't drop the ball, and that the communities around the country who are crying out for help, who have pollution issues, get the help that they deserve under the law. And like was discussed earlier today, investigations, research, and remediation efforts are very expensive. So this law is very important to assist communities with that, because communities should not be burdened with having to pay for these tests, for this research, for the remediation efforts themselves. So Trevor's Law will go a long ways to help that and hopefully help that funding issue among other things, and get answers swiftly as well. And so what we've done is, with the foundation, is in the meantime, while CDC works to schedule the focus groups, to get the cancer cluster guidelines updated, we've created our Childhood Cancer Cluster Buster program. And what we're doing is we are collecting data on childhood cancer cases throughout the United States. And we're mapping those cases so we can prove out where there are childhood cancer clusters, and we can use this data and this information to ensure that Trevor's Law is implemented in the areas that it needs to be. And so we can make sure that our state governments who need to reach out to the federal government to request the assistance from Trevor's Law, we can ensure that that we can tell them that they know where the problem areas are, and that we can get assistance from Trevor's Law. Go ahead in the next slide. Another project that we're working on is we're working with a local company called VOC Pro Shield. VOC Pro Shield is a company that has developed a coating to coat crumb rubber or playground mulch before it is released onto athletic fields or playgrounds, because I'm sure probably many of you are aware that crumb rubber that comes from recycled tires has VOCs in it, and volatile organic compounds that are released when they're on the field. So children, soccer players, football players, other athletes that play on synthetic turf are exposed to VOCs that's released from the crumb rubber. So this VOC Pro Shield has created a coating to coat crumb rubber before it's dispersed onto fields or playground mulch, and it prevents the VOCs and other chemicals from being released, thus protecting children and others from exposure to volatile organic compounds. And it's been tested against everything imaginable, from UV to nail polish remover to pet urine, and it has I believe a 40-year life on the coating. So we're excited about that project. We're still working on that, but I think that'll go a long way, so we can at least tackle one part of the issue. There's very many pollution sources, right? But we can at least begin to tackle one of the issues with this, and then work up from there in protecting against other exposures as well. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And that's it. That's all I have tonight. And just the best thing right now that we can do moving forward is to continue to fill out our map, continue to collect childhood cancer case data, so we can prove out our childhood cancer clusters, and we can ensure that every community that needs help and assistance from Trevor's Law gets it. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I want to really thank you for your determination in regards to staying at something. I can only imagine how difficult and tedious it is to put together a federal law and then to stay on top of it, and not to live in Washington, D.C., mind you, not to be there, not to be able to afford a lobbyist that stays on top of it. I think this law, when you talk to scientists, whether they're epidemiologists, whether they're environmentalists, any scientist needs data. You need data, you need numbers, you need figures, and then from that data, you can then go forward and put together a hypothesis. And especially with cancer, we need to look at where clusters are, because then we can start to ask, is it the water? Is it the ground? Is it the lead paint? Right? Once you get those things down pat, then you can move forward and clean those issues up. And the first thing you want to do is warn people, don't drink the water. Stay away from the lead paint. And then you start preventing illness, you start preventing disease, and you improve life. Thank you very much, Trevor. Just one technical point. Previously, we had an issue with the raising of hands. So we're gonna, Brent, if it's okay, we'll open this up to if anyone has a question, either for Cathy Swanson or for the great work that Trevor's doing. Can you please open up the participant box? You'll see your name listed. I see one hand there, Irma. Great. Irma, you'll have 60 seconds to state your question, and then we'll refer it either to Cathy or Trevor. Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much for presenting this. I believe that last year I attended a council meeting where the first Cathy, I believe she made a presentation because I had already heard this presentation. So we're now almost 1 year later. And I understand that, you know, with the situation that has happened now with COVID and stuff, but what are we looking for in terms of moving forward to doing something? Because like I said, I heard this presentation a year ago, and I just want to know what the council has done, and maybe you're the board or you're in the Pico Water. So yeah, how are we moving forward to doing something, whether it's getting grant funding for this or something else? Go ahead.
Irma, thank you for the question. Brent, if you don't mind, I'll start it off. You know, as a board member at Pico Water, we deal with the exact same issue that the city's dealing with. And you're right, this presentation was presented about a year ago, but every time I listen to it, I learn something new. But nevertheless, so we waited for the California State Drinking Water Board to set what the limit was going to be for the notification and for the response level. Once we once they determine what that level would be, we then had to test our wells because we wanted to see where our water fit that metric. Once we noticed that our wells were over the notification level, we then started to devise a plan. And what we've done is that we hired an engineer, because you need to spec out your system. You need to determine what type of water quality you have, not just PFOS, PFOA, but the other minerals, such as calcium, because these other minerals will compete with the resin and they'll compete with the PFOS and PFOA. So based upon a thorough study of your water, then you'll determine how many filters you need for your wells, how much resin you're gonna need, how many times you're gonna have to change that out throughout the year. So Pico Water, we're in the middle of that process. I'm not sure if you happen to see a number of fire hydrants that had black trash bags on them over the past month. I know it was brought up in one of the Facebook forums. They said, hey, why do we have black trash cans over these yellow fire hydrants? Well, that was because we had a sensor at the top of those fire hydrants, and they were going through and they were testing our well system, our water system. And they were testing it because they were determining how much material we would need. So once we have that technical data, then we can go ahead and determine how many well sites we need to treat. And then the other factor is paying for it. So I can tell you at Pico Water, we're hoping to have filters in hopefully by the start of middle of next year. And then we'll start to clean up our water. And I want to tell you that we're kind of ahead of the curve in terms of getting this up off the ground and making sure that our water is clean. Brent, do you want to touch on what the city's been doing?
Yeah, we are working to do much of the same of what Pico Water kind of pioneered the way to do, to be perfectly honest. We are looking to install, like I said, the double filtration system with both, I believe, the resin and also activated carbon as a double method. And the reason we want to do that is because it's not just PFOS and PFOA, the two particles. There are dozens, if not, Cathy, you correct me if I'm wrong, if not hundreds of different particles that exist in water, not necessarily our water, but they exist. And we are anticipating the state of California mandating testing for those additional chemicals in the very near future, and also requiring compliance. And so we can address PFOS and PFOA right now, but we might be implementing a system that may not address the other particles that are going to be legislated in the very near future. And so we're trying to make sure we're creating a comprehensive solution, because right now we know about PFOS and PFOA. That is a problem. We need to clean up our water. What alarmed me, once again in this presentation, is how widespread these chemicals are, literally in everyday products. It's not just your water. I remember reading Glide floss apparently used PFOS and PFOA. I don't know if they still use it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I use Glide floss. That's terrifying. So it's not just in the water, but we have to clean up the water as a source because everyone uses it all the time. It's a public good. So we are being proactive and taking steps. We're also trying to make sure we're being comprehensive. And as Andrew said, this costs money, and there needs to be accountability. I know Andrew didn't put PFOS and PFOA in our water. I know I didn't. I know you all on this call didn't. And so we want to make sure we're implementing these solutions, going after grants. If it's low interest loans, maybe that's something that we can do. But unless we do those things, unless we find additional sources of funding, we will have to increase the cost or the price of water. And this isn't your fault. We shouldn't have to do that to clean something up that isn't your fault. So that is a little bit about what we're doing, and what Pico Water is doing. So I appreciate the question, Irma. I think that's the right question to ask. What is it that we have done over the last year, and what is it that we're looking to do in the very near future to remedy this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Irma.
Thank you.
Why don't we go with Galaxy 69? Why don't we go ahead and see what type of question they have? Yes. Can you please state your name?
My name is Chris. My question has to do with, I understand you've been in the water district since 2013, you said?
Yeah.
And this whole kind of thing was stimulated back in 2009. From going off of what Irma's stating, there's also the presentation kind of being a year old. It just seems that, we're in an election year. What is really, at the long run, because all I'm hearing is the fact that, it's not just the PFOS5, there's other chemicals that we need to be aware of. It's not just the water that we need to clean up, but now we've got children and families with these chemicals in their system already. What's in place to help that? I mean, if we clean up the water, what's going to take care of the children in the long run and the families that are suffering with issues currently?
Thank you very much for your question. That's why I wanted to add Trevor's Law and Trevor Schaefer to this program, because they work hand in hand. It's not just a matter of, hey, let's clean up our water because it tastes bad, but it's because there's carcinogens in it. And I want to tell you that Cristina Garcia's legislation that really transformed the way we look at PFOS and PFOA didn't really take place until 2018. Cathy, do you want to correct me in terms of, or maybe add when the revised standards came out and everyone kind of woke up in terms of they needed to start treating this?
It was 2016 that the EPA kind of sounded the alarm and brought it down to 70 parts per trillion. And, in California, the limit, a year ago, I don't think we knew what the limit was going to be in California. I can't remember what that date was, but it hasn't been that long. And even then, I don't believe that they require compliance yet. Kind of to answer your question, Chris, a little bit, I'm not an epidemiologist or doctor, but I have heard people speak, and I know that there is sort of a half-life of these chemicals in the body. They did quit making PFOS. 3M quit making it, I don't know, I think in 2008. People have less in their body today than they did 10, 15 years ago. It will eventually be released from the body. It just takes a number of years to do it. So, you know, the sooner we get started, the better off we'll be in the future, really.
Yeah, and I also want to say, first of all, thank you for the question. These are the right questions to ask. I don't think California, as Andrew and Cathy have said, has really taken this seriously until very recently. I know East Coast states, they've been dealing with this and they've been sounding the alarm for maybe almost about 2 decades now. Maybe not testing at super high levels, but they've been addressing this issue for a very long time. And California only recently, discovered that this was an issue and started testing once again because of the Assembly members' legislation pushing it. The other thing is the EPA's thresholds are much higher than what the state of California is now legislating. And even before this current legislation, the thresholds were still relatively, well, they were lower than what the EPA recommended. If we go by EPA standards, Pico Rivera is actually in compliance. 70 parts per trillion is the current EPA standard. We are finding out that that standard is probably too high. And we need to do more to clean up our water from, with these particles in it. And so the state of California now is very aggressively monitoring, and our agencies are very aggressively figuring out how to get rid of this. It has taken a while. I know 2009 is like when the federal government started sounding the alarm, but it wasn't really a thing in California, or at least we didn't know until recently. The other thing is, and I actually learned this from the general manager, Mark Grajeda of Pico Water District. There are literally hundreds of things that get tested for in water, several hundred things. And you don't test for all of those things all of the time. You test for some of them some of the time. And that's all mandated by law, by both federal and state law. So you test for lead periodically, you test for mercury periodically. You don't test, constantly for every single chemical. What the legislation now has done is force testing more often for these particular chemicals, which agencies weren't testing for before. I don't believe we tested for these before 2017, somewhere around there. And even when we did test for them, and they were in like 25 to 39 parts per trillion, it was below EPA standard. So we thought, okay, we're below EPA standard. But like I said, we are learning more now about the impact of these chemicals, and we're doing everything we can to move as quickly as we can to create the comprehensive solutions we need to clean the water up.
Just real briefly,
Andrew.
Chris, just one more comment, and I won't harp on it too much, but I think it's been a failure on the part of the EPA and the federal government to critically look at their values. When you take a look at that documentary, The Devil That We Know, or read one of the books in Exposure, what DuPont and 3M do, the companies that use these PFOS and PFOA, what they did is they started to pack these oversight committees with lobbyists associated with these companies. And they started to downplay the health effects that these forever chemicals had on people. Not only did they downplay that, but they also refused to budge the limits. So we've seen this story play out before with tobacco, with other items, and it's happened with our water. So I thank you for the question. I thank you, and I thank you for holding us, as an elected official. I want to be held accountable because I view myself as the gatekeeper for water for my community. So when this thing kind of erupted, people came to me and they wanted to know what we knew and what we were doing. And I want to tell you something. I want to reserve always the right to become smarter in life and to educate myself more, because there is something I don't know today that I will find out tomorrow that will be a red flag for me. And I just want to present that with all honesty and sincerity and trying to correct things. Does anyone have any other questions? Would anyone like to raise their hand? Okay. Well, Irma, I see your hand up again. What we're gonna do is we're gonna transition to our last part of our presentation, and we'll just spend a few minutes on it, and then Irma will get back to your question. I think that's only fair. But Arlene, if you don't mind opening up the presentation, we wanted to raise this question: is the Pico Water Authority for sale? And do you have that video clip? And do you have it queued up? Maybe if you can switch to that. Because we raised the question, is the Pico Water Authority for sale? And I wanted to present something and show you that it's not something we're making up, but rather it's something that they were talking about. And I think it's fair to talk about in a certain context. So if you don't mind playing this, Arlene. And this was from the June 23rd, 2020 budget study session.
Audio may be a little echoey, so bear with me.
Okay.
With that, you were going to, I'd asked a question about water, city manager, in regards to the water itself. And again, we were able to transfer some, but as it relates to any potential revenue increase or revenue enhancements, what does that look like?
I definitely would have to take a look at how we can raise our water rates. If you take a look at our unfunded needs, they're quite substantial. One of the things I'll be requesting from council in the near future is to study whether or not that is an asset we want to continue to operate, considering the amount of infrastructure that's needed to bring it into compliance moving forward in the future. So with that, rates will be part of that consideration.
Okay, thank you, Arlene. You could go ahead and pause it. What I wanted to highlight is that's our city manager of the city of Pico Rivera, Steve Carmona, and he's talking about in the context of COVID-19 and how it's impacted our budget and how the city was looking at a $9 million deficit. And he was raising the question, hey, we have about $100 million. One slide shows 100 million, the other slide shows 113 million. We have this infrastructure that we need to tackle. Should we consider selling the water department? And I think it's a fair question in the context. It's a question that could be discussed. But then when I started to look at their numbers, I think I started to get a little confused, and I had some questions on this slide here that you're looking at, or the one back with 13 million. They list PFOS treatment project at 13 million. And this was a slide taken from the finance director. And then the next slide, and mind you, this is the same study session, June 23rd, real small there on the upper left-hand corner, it's PFOS, PFOA treatment. Oh, go back. Real small, they list their cleanup at 25 million. So the finance director is saying, hey, we need $13 million to clean up our PFOS, PFOA. But then the other slide is saying, hey, we need $25 million to clean up PFOS and PFOA. I don't know if I trust those numbers, to be honest with you. I don't trust those numbers because I know how much it's going to cost Pico Water. We initially talked about maybe it costing potentially $4 to $5 million. Cathy, do you have any type of insight in terms of how much it might cost a water system such as the city to clean up PFOS and PFOA?
It's going to take you a couple $1 million to build the site. I gave you the numbers for the treatment system, right? So you still need to have pipes that go to the treatment system and from the treatment system and all that stuff. You need the engineering firm to design it, the construction firm to do it. So yeah, I mean, you're probably, call it $5 million a site. I don't know. I mean, I can really only talk to what the treatment part of it is.
Got it. So when I
And
saw
Andrew,
this,
can I?
yes, go ahead, Brent.
Yeah. I think, given that it's the city, I think it's fair that I chime in a little bit. The question of whether or not the water agency should be operated by the city or sold to be operated by another entity, probably a private company, is a very serious question for us to consider. Is it good or bad? I can't give you the answer right now because I don't have all the information. I will say that for a public good like water, I don't know if a private company coming in and operating is the best idea. There are private water companies out there in the state of California. They might be good. They might not be good. Like I said, I don't have that information just yet. This is all relatively new, this conversation. And what I worry about, though, is if we sell it to a private company, private companies in the private sector focus on profits. That is what they exist for. And governments don't focus on profits. We focus on balancing the budget to provide the service and the good that we deliver, but we don't focus on profit. And so what I worry about when we have a conversation about selling the water agency is, will a private company try to increase their profits by decreasing levels of services, by decreasing costs somehow that may not be in the best interest, and we lose the ability to hold someone accountable if a private company is operating it. Whereas if it continues to stay under the city, you can hold me accountable as an elected official. You can hold council accountable as elected officials if things are not going right and things are being ignored, or services are being cut or whatever it may be. And I think that's a good thing, right? You should hold people accountable. So that's one of the main things that I think about. In terms of the numbers being listed here in the conversation, once again, it is in the context of a huge budget deficit that the city is facing. And our city manager was looking at all available options to decrease that deficit and essentially increase all our long-term budget prospects, right? And this was one of those items that he brought up. Does that mean the city manager is set on it? Not necessarily. Maybe not necessarily. We don't know. And just last night, actually, it was stated very clearly because of this forum that was being publicized that the city was not going to be looking into that. And so, there's an interesting reaction to our action of holding this forum and posing that question because it arose at a previous meeting. But I think this is a conversation that we should be having. And the numbers, whether they are corrected, now remember the number about 25 million, that's over 5 years, right? That is the projected cost over 5 years to treat PFOS and PFOA. Now, whether those numbers are correct or incorrect, I honestly think Andrew might be a little bit better equipped to answer that question because that is literally what he deals with as a director in Pico Water Agency. But I think that ultimately the question should be, do we as a community want to continue operating the water agency under our public government, or do we not? And that's tonight is the beginning of that conversation, so that we can inform our elected body and inform our city of what the community thinks. And so with that, I want to hand it back over to you, Andrew.
Brent, I want to thank you for putting that in perspective. And mind you, and that news last night that was issued by the at the city council meeting that the city's not looking to sell their water system, I think is important. But what I think the city of Pico Rivera, what they were looking at doing, and mind you, I mention this information not to be critical, but just to be informative. And I think that makes a strong community when you inform people. But if you go back to that last slide about the city of Montebello, I think the city of Pico Rivera, what they're looking at doing is they saw what Montebello did, and Montebello sold part of their water system. And they were in a different situation. They were about 1,500 connections. The city of Pico Rivera has about 9,500 connections. But Montebello sold their water system for about $18 million. That sale is still pending, but that $18 million helps the city offset other costs. So when I listen to our city manager in the city of Pico Rivera talk about selling the water system, I understand where he's coming from, because he's potentially thinking, hey, we could sell our water system for about $40 million, probably a little bit north of that if there's a private buyer. The city would get a $40 million surplus. It would turn around their budget. It would help everything. But the downside to that is that we just sold off a natural resource that was in public hands. We just eliminated jobs in the field. We just eliminated jobs in the office. And we just sold off a division of the city that actually makes money. And when you take a look at that whole budget session, they're transferring about $1 million. Sorry, Brent, I'm going to step on your toes a little bit. They're transferring about $1 million from the water fund to the general fund to help offset the deficit that they're facing. So it's a fair question to ask. I'm not being, critical of it, but I think we just need to raise awareness to what's happening and stay more informed. Brent, do you have any other words? If not, I was going to open it up for a last question. I think there's Irma who continues to have her hand up. I think it's fair that we go to her.
Let's go to Irma.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question and for this whole presentation and forum. It was very educational and informative. That was one of the questions, is what are our neighboring cities doing? And you just mentioned Montebello being one of them that sold off a portion or their portion of their water source. Just the other question was, where can we get the funding so that we don't impact the residents of Pico Rivera? Is it through like Senator Archuleta? Is it through the federal government? I mean, where would you get the funding is where I'm questioning.
Irma, thank you very much for the question. I think that's really the question that we're all grasping at. The fastest way to do it is to take out a low interest loan, but then that cost is going to be placed, the burden is going to be upon our community. I don't want that to happen. Cristina Garcia talked about it, since this was her kind of brainchild, if you will. She's the one who's been pushing this. She's also trying to push legislation so that we get funding to offset our costs. Right now, there's really not much because we're in the same boat of multiple communities. Not only is the Central Basin, our area, dealing with this, but also you have multiple communities in Orange County that are dealing with high PFOS, PFOA levels.
Central Valley.
Yeah, so we are looking at WRD, that's a Water Replenishment District. And that's a government agency that's responsible for refilling, if you will, the aquifers in our basin. So Pico Rivera is sandwiched by the spreading ground. Water is occasionally dumped there. It pools, it sinks to the bottom, and that water refills our aquifers so that we have wells and we pull that water back up. WRD has a clean drinking water fund, and they have about $20 million set aside. So what we've done at Pico Water is we've wanted to spec everything out. We brought in an engineer, we have our blueprints. So then we go to WRD and say, hey, look, we have everything set to go. Can you help us with the funding? So that's one thing we're actively looking at, Irma. at Pico Water, and I know that the city is. And I want to tell you that we've collaborated actually with the city on this issue about finding funding, about we'd like to collaborate more. I think COVID put a wrench in a lot of things. The city has multiple plates that they're spinning, but we're trying to move forward. I know the city is also in terms of cleanup. Brent, do you want to speak to funding?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That is, Irma, that is the $10 million question. Nobody knows where the funding is going to come from. Everyone's pointing the finger at somewhere else. I will say we raised, as a city, a concern to the assembly member. You have prompted, rightly, this testing. You have prompted these lower levels for these chemicals, once again, correctly, but there has been no funding made available to remediate this problem. And as we already established, none of us are responsible for this. We didn't dump this into our water. So we are looking for grant funding. I believe WRD is potentially making some grant funding available in the very near future, and or low interest loans. I believe that potentially the federal government might be looking at it, but that's a much longer runway likely. So there are different avenues potentially. The immediate thing that I think we can do, at least to get the system started, is right now our budget deficit is not great. We've managed to close it quite a bit. We're still operating at about $1 million deficit, a little bit more actually. We're able to absorb that though because we have a very healthy financial reserve, $20 million about. I think, depending on what the economy does, I think we use some of that reserve to install the systems. Whether it's an IOU that we create, that's not the official government term. We don't call things IOUs, but whether it's an IOU from the water fund to the general fund, and we say, hey, water fund, right now you're still making $1 million a year. You're going to pay back the general fund, $1 million a year until the reserve is made whole again. But I think we could use some of that reserve money to immediately get the infrastructure in place. That's what I would recommend currently. I also think we aggressively pursue every grant opportunity and even low cost loan opportunity. Andrew.
Yeah, Irma, and one last thing, and I think this goes to Chris, if Chris is still here. One of the things we've also looked at Pico Water is we have a law firm that came to us and said, we want to investigate who polluted this water because we want to go after them. And we said, by all means. So we've partnered with a law firm that is actively looking at who potentially could have been the main culprits for putting PFOS and PFOA. In the city of Pico Rivera, we had the Northrop plant right in the middle, and we had the Ford plant before that. And a lot of metal plating was taking place. A lot of chemicals were being used, fire retardant there at the Northrop plant. So could they have been responsible for some of the PFOS, PFOA? And I think that's an important avenue to go after, because not only can you go after potential cleanup in the future, but also damages for destroying the city's natural resource. So I think that's a main component, not only going after funding, whether it's federal, state, grants, heaven forbid it's raising rates, but that would be the last thing to do. But then it's also looking at what type of legal options we have as governing boards, as governing bodies, so that the city, the community is represented. Trevor, did you have a question or anything that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. So first, my question is, do you have high cancer rates in Pico?
You know, that's something that it would be great if we had more of a database to be able to look at, but that's one of the things that's been brought to our attention also. And it's information still in work. I don't have the exact numbers right now.
Okay, so yeah, so on that note, proving high cancer rates will get the assistance of Trevor's Law and will really help with the funding issue. And that's one of the main reasons that we worked to get this law passed for so many years, is because I mean, we don't have, as citizens, we don't have the funding, and even local and state governments usually don't have the funding to address issues like that. So that was one of the big reasons that that we worked to get the bill passed. So Trevor's Law will help with that if we can get, you know, if we can prove out that there are high cancer rates in the area, what we're trying to do with childhood cancer by proving that, to get the assistance from Trevor's Law. And that will solve, I mean, some of that is still up in the air about how the federal government's going to carry that out. You know, they still need to get more funding. I think they have $2.5 million for Trevor's Law right now, which we know we need more than that. Remediation costs a lot more than that. I mean, that won't even cover one community. But you know, as CDC moves forward, that's one thing that Trevor's Law will be able to assist with. You know, but that's I think going to be a little more long term, because we don't know now when the CDC plans to hold their focus group discussions and when they plan to finish with their restructuring, and they still have to do that before they implement. So we don't know if that's going to be next year or 2022. So I mean, in the meantime, certainly pursue other sources, but once we're able to iron out the details with Trevor's Law with the CDC, that will definitely be a resource as well.
And we'll be able to access and look at that information a lot easier. And that's one of the things that HIPAA, you know, the signing of HIPAA, which is the Health Information Privacy Act, which gives patients privacy, right? You can't share people's information. But at the same time, it created an obstacle in terms of looking at some of this data, some of this cancer data. And Trevor's Law provides a foundation where we can start looking at cancer clusters and see where it's spread out, and then start making some notions about what are some of the causes. So we said we were going to go till 8 o'clock. We have breached that time limit. We're at 8:07. Is there? I see that there's one more person, Al Navarro.
And I'll say, yeah. Andrew and I will stay on.
Yes.
So you know, the program was supposed to end at 8. Everyone is welcome to stay to hear the next question. If there's an additional question after that, that's fine. Andrew and I are going to stay on, and we are going to take this question from Navarro Wenzel. And if our tech person can unmute, perfect.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Trevor for his family putting forward Trevor's Law. As a survivor of lead poisoning as a child myself, I know how difficult, painful all of these cancers and diseases can be personally. And I appreciate the meetings that you are holding, the information that you are sharing, because if this information wasn't going out to the public, no one would know what is in their water and what possible causes of diseases, cancers, and so forth that the citizens of Pico Rivera could have, and the long-term effects in their lives. As a person who grew up in Pico Rivera since 7 years old, I have seen a few children, because I am also an educator in Pico Rivera, and I have been for 25 years, and I have seen some children who have come through our systems with cancer. So Trevor, thank you for that, because there is a possibility that there have been cancers, not only recently, but in the past, and maybe that data can help. And I appreciate that Trevor is offering, you know, that his not company, but his program is offering, you know, funding if that is possible. On the other side, I also am leery of the water board of the water company being sold in Pico Rivera, because then we will lose control of, you know, who could we contact if something does happen, if someone does get sick. Who do we hold responsible if you sell that off? These companies can tell us whatever they want. Whoever buys it can tell us whatever they want. And we'll just have to take that with a grain of salt and say, okay. And so personally, I would like for the water company, water board not to be sold, because then we know who we can go to, like you said, Mr. Tercero, that we can come to you and talk to you directly, that we can come to Mr. Lara and come to Mr. Lara and talk to him directly. Once this is sold off, you know, these big companies will just push you aside. So we have to be careful, and I understand this could be a cost added to us citizens of Pico Rivera and homeowners of Pico Rivera, but the thing is, you know, we have to understand that, yes, we didn't cause this, but we may have to pay a little to help clean it up. And the thing is I understand and I appreciate you wanting to go and find funding wherever it may be, whether it's a state, county, city, you know, federal government, state government. That's great. If that happens, I am all for it. You know, nobody wants an extra added to their bill, but at the same time, this mess is here and we have to do something about it. We cannot allow this to affect our children, our grandchildren, family members. We have to do something about it. And trying to push it off somewhere else or on somebody else isn't going to fix it. So I agree with you all. I appreciate all the ways you're looking for funding, and I am all for it. Whatever happens, happens, and we just need to fix this problem. Thank you for your time, your effort. I appreciate all of you.
Thank you very much. I
for that.
appreciate your comment. I appreciate your comment, because it is true. Maybe at the end of the day, sometimes you wait for funding and it just doesn't show up. And we got this problem now. We need to fix it now. We needed to fix it last year, like Irma was talking about, but we had to get some things in order. But we need to fix this now, and sometimes we can't wait for funding, unfortunately.
And I think that's why it's important. Like I said, we have some reserves. We can at least get it up and running. We don't need the system at every single well. I remember our city manager said if we put the system in at about 3 wells, we could still operate at the capacity we need for the city. So maybe we take a little bit of money from our reserve and get this done as quickly as possible. And then, yes, we go look for grants and we go look for low interest loans and we pay it back as best we can. I think that's all important. We are looking at this. Andrew and I are looking at different ways to fund this as quickly as possible. And I appreciate you for bringing that up.
We have another question by Cora.
Hi, this is actually Leticia Vasquez Wilson, and I'm the president of the Central Basin Municipal Water District. And I want to thank you for providing yet another workshop with so much wonderful information for members of the community. I also want to once again offer the Central Basin Municipal Water District water. As you know, the Central Basin sells water to 24 cities in LA County. Central Basin delivers the cleanest water supply that we get from Northern California and the Colorado River to cities across Southern California. I know that we have been in discussions with Mr. Mark Grajeda from the Pico Water District to be a supplier of clean water, of our clean water to your water district. And I believe the cost to build that connection is approximately a little under $1 million. I believe that the residents in the city that are of Pico Rivera that are both serviced by the city and the Pico Water District, have, the right to have access to clean water. And I hope that the Pico Water District will do the right thing and consider purchasing clean water for their residents. So I will look forward to meeting with you all so that we can consider doing that. And also, I know that the city of Pico Rivera does have a connection to the water source of the Central Basin Water District, I believe. And so we will certainly be engaging in discussions with them.
Great, thank you very much, President Leticia Vasquez, for coming and sharing that. So what the president of the board is talking about from Central Basin is there's two ways to get water into our aquifers. There is imported water that comes from the State Water Project. Think of Lake Oroville and the big aquifers, and it all comes down to Southern California. And then there's also water from the Colorado River. Now, and that is the water that's sold by Central Basin, and President Vasquez is correct. That water does not have PFOS and PFOA. At times they do have issues with coagulant mussels that prevents them from selling water, but there has been much discussion and much debate within the water community because we are having persistent climate change, because we are having decades of drought. We are seeing a decreased water supply coming from the Colorado River and potentially from up north. Because of that, because of a decreased supply, the rates for imported water will drastically increase. And that's why WRD created the GRIP program here in Pico Rivera. So what the GRIP program does is it takes purple pipe water, recycled water, and it does reverse osmosis. It does reverse osmosis, I believe, 2 or 3 times. They take that purified water and then they put it in the spreading grounds. We've looked at the financial projections of how much money it would cost to buy water from Central Basin or to buy water from WRD. The projections are much less because WRD is not reliant upon the Colorado River or water coming from the north. So we stay with WRD. The question then is, how do we clean up PFOS, PFOA? How do we clean up our water contaminants? Well, we put in filters. We consult with people like Cathy, and this is one major thing we did not say at the beginning. Pico Water and the city of Pico Rivera have no financial ties with Purelight. We don't have any business with Purelight. We don't have any business with Trevor Schaefer. So we've looked at specialists like Cathy Swanson to come in and say, look, you can clean up your water and you can create non-detect with PFOS and PFOA, and this is how you do it. The other thing is that we don't have a water connection with Central Basin. We have a recycled water connection, and that goes to Smith Park. Hopefully one day that'll go to our medians, but we don't have a water connection to be able to buy potable water from Central Basin. And that would take at least a few $1 million to activate, to lay pipe, to connect with Central Basin. Not only that, but you have a yearly charge. So there's several moving pieces to that discussion, but President Vasquez, thank you very much for the question. Thank you for being part of the discussion. I think it's a fair question. I think it's a fair question, and I think it's something that's fair that you bring to the table. And mind you, I will always be open to Central Basin in terms of their ideas and in terms of how we move our communities forward, providing them with clean drinking water at the lowest possible price. Let me see if, Brent, do you have anything to add? If not, I think that's our last question.
I think I just want to thank everyone for coming and staying, by the way, past our time. We still have 32 participants. I think our max was about 43, 44. So you all stayed on past our time. Thank you. The purpose of this was to get information out and educate the community specifically about PFOS, PFOA, and also to start the conversation about whether the city of Pico Rivera should look to sell its water agency if that is an option that's put on the table. Like I said, that was briefly brought up in June, and then last night was said it's not an option, but I think we have the conversation now so that we know, is this something we even want to entertain in the future if we need to continue balancing our budget? So honestly, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. This was an awesome event. I want to thank our speakers, Cathy and Trevor. Thank you so much. If we were in person, this is the time where, you know, we would give you some sort of mug from the city or something, and maybe from the water district. Unfortunately, we aren't in person, but I do want to say thank you for making yourselves available to our community and talking about this. These are really important issues. Trevor, particularly for what you've brought up. I know my family, particularly on my mom's side, and they all have lived in Pico for a very long time. All of my aunts and my mother have all had cancer. My grandmother and grandfather had cancer, and luckily they were able to win their fight with cancer. But I know other residents and other people in nearby communities aren't as lucky. And so I appreciate you coming and telling us about this. I know that this is something I'm going to bring up with our city manager. How can we leverage this? How can we leverage Trevor's Law in order to fight for more funding? And I learned something tonight too. So Andrew, thank you for bringing Trevor. And actually, I do want to highlight Arlene, if Arlene is still on. She is our tech person. She is also going to be a school board member come November 3rd.